Thanks, Kate. While this is getting set up, I thought I'd share my very scary fear of speaking. It's new, relatively new. The last 2 weeks, I've been having stress dreams that my water will break in the middle of giving this talk. So I've just decided if that happens, I'm going to finish anyway, so if you're all cool with that. Luckily, my husband's one of the volunteers, so he'll just mop up after me, and we'll head to the hospital together. It'll be fine. So my name is Erica Correa. I work at Exo Group. You can say Correa if the double R scares you. Also respond to Correa, Carrera. Very approachable, so come talk to me after this. This is my son, Tino. He's 3.5. He's not quite as angelic as he seems in this picture. But this is up because instead of doing irregular slides, I thought it would be fun to present on the simulator, so I actually made the presentation into an app. So, without further ado, Need for Speed. This is me and some of the other iOS engineers that work on the Not Wedding Planner app together, some of the designers, product managers. We all dress as party parrots for Halloween. Very nerdy. This is actually in Giphy, so if you want to use it, I know you do, you can find it. So I'm going to be talking about how Exo optimized the image loading time on the Not Wedding Planner app and why that is a big deal. So just for some context before we get started, if you haven't used the Not Wedding Planner app, it is the #1 wedding planning app in the country. It's pretty large. It has basically everything that you can think to do for your wedding, a checklist to keep you on track. It'll help keep track of your budget, help you find the vendors that you need, get your registry going, create a free website, manage your guest list, all of this crazy stuff that happens while you're planning this very important day in your life, all in one app. We have about 20 iOS engineers stateside, and we have an additional 5 engineers in our China office that all work on this app together. So big app means sometimes we have big problems. So let's talk about one of them. So this all started when I went to the Strange Loop conference about 2 years ago in St. Louis. And I was sitting in an auditorium just like you guys. And it was a talk by Paul Kinlan called The Future of Mobile Web. So not 100% applicable to native iOS, but I thought it sounded interesting. And he dropped this stat in the middle of the talk. 40% of users abandon a site that takes more than 3 seconds to load. So I don't know about you, but I started to panic in the auditorium because I felt like our app definitely takes longer than that. I'm pretty sure it takes longer than that. And I know it's not mobile web, but still probably important. So I started frantically tapping on our app and counting in my head, and then tapping on other big apps, all over my phone and counting. And I'm like, some of these are pretty good, some of these are pretty bad. We should probably tell them that they need to fix this. So I was wondering what these stats looked like for native, if that kind of information was available. So I went back to my hotel room and did some Googling, and sure enough, our app users are very picky. They want this app to launch in 4 seconds or less, or they get very angry. And so we also happen to know that 23% of users abandon an app after the first use. So what does this mean? If they're downloading your app from the App Store for the first time, and it takes longer than 4 seconds for it to load, I'm sure you are heavily influencing that abandonment. And if you can get your app launch time down, maybe you'd get more people to stay and use the app again and again. So what that tells us is that there really is not a second to spare in making that great first impression in your app. So, all right, I know that ours is longer just by kind of counting in my head, but when I got back to the office, I wanted to see some hard numbers, like how long is our app actually taking to launch? Prepare yourselves. 8.6 seconds was our app launch time. Yeah, and on top of that, we were also presenting an artificial launch screen while our Taplytics experiments loaded on the dash. So it was actually seemed even longer for the user, if you can imagine it. So the way that you can measure this, if you feel like you might have this problem as well, is just go into your scheme and put in DYLD print statistics with a value of 1. I'm not sure, it's kind of blurry, but you can pull this repo down when you get home and look at it. You want to pick the scheme that's closest to whatever scheme you use for your App Store builds, because it will make a difference. Other things that make a difference with your app launch time, and again, launch time I mean from the time you tap open the app and your dashboard loads, the first screen in the app loads, would be your device type. So if you have the first iPhone that ever came out still, I don't think any of your apps would probably work at this point, but if they did, they would take a long time to load. However good your internet is, most apps make an API call on launch. So obviously, if your internet isn't that fast, then it's going to slow down the app launch time. And then also there's a big difference between cold and warm starts. So a warm start would be you already have this app on your phone, you've opened it before, now you're opening it again. And a cold start would be that first time. So we really cared about the cold app launch time because that really is the first impression that your users are getting. So that's what we went with. So this 8.6 is our cold start, like our worst number. So, okay, what's taking so long? I was really surprised to learn that actually the biggest reason that our app was taking so long to launch was because we had a massive asset catalog. This was very surprising to me, probably surprising to some of you. When I had originally started Googling around about how to decrease your app launch time, there were tons of resources, WWDC talks, articles, case studies about people like reducing what they're doing during finish launching with options, or moving to more structs than classes because those build a little faster, or reducing their headers, right, like having less Objective-C in the code. There was nothing about images and the time that it takes to load. And I actually, when I told my team that actually most of your images in your asset catalog are loaded when you first launch your app, they were all as surprised as I was. I thought that they got loaded once they were going to be in the view that they were rendered in, but actually they're all loaded when you first launch the app. So because we had over 300 assets in our catalog at that point and such a giant app, 70% of our launch time was gobbled up by loading those images. So what do you do in that case? We didn't want to say, okay, yeah, we have this problem, we have too many assets, so we're just going to reduce the number of images in our app, because then all of a sudden our app would look kind of boring. By the way, I'm pretty sure you can tell why I became an engineer and not a designer from this app that I made. So it would probably look a lot like this if it had less images, right? And that's not something that users want to see. That's just something engineers don't mind watching while I'm giving a talk. So they're so important to delighting the users and making your screens look really nice. And they also help with the UX. So we can't just say, okay, we're just not going to have images anymore. We had to say we have to treat these images differently and get a little bit creative. So here's a couple of solutions we came up with. First, I had a sneaky suspicion that some of the images that were in our asset catalog weren't even being used anymore, and it turns out I was right. We try different things. We have experiments going. This view works for a while, and then all of a sudden we're going to come up with this new view, and the file gets deleted, and the assets are just like the residue that gets left behind, right? And the engineer forgets to go in and delete those images. So I found this really cool resource called LS Unused Resources, and it's free, and you literally just install it, point it to the path directory for your file, for your project, and hit browse, and it'll come up with a bunch of images that it doesn't think is in your app. And it does this by looking at the name of the image and trying to find a matching string. So you do want to be a little bit careful because we had some false positives. For example, in our app, we have a bunch of Best of Wedding awards. So it'll be Best of Weddings 2009, Best of Weddings 2010, Best of Weddings 2011. Obviously, we don't call each one of those. We looped through, right, and then built the string dynamically at runtime. So if you're doing that anywhere, it's not going to see that match because it doesn't see the full name of the image in the app. We also use enums a lot for a lot of our images that we're not calling strings everywhere, and sometimes it didn't see those cases, so you just need to be a little bit careful. But for the most part, it was pretty reliable. We were able to remove a bunch of images, and this is something that's ongoing, so I do this about every 6 months just to make sure that as we're deleting files, we're deleting the images along with them, so that our asset catalog will get smaller and smaller as the years go on. We decided not to redo any of the images that we had for this next idea, which was treating our images a little bit differently, our vector images and our bitmap images. For those of you who don't know the difference, I can show you real quick with an example, if this decides to let me, in our app. There we go. So here's the Not app. And it still feels like it's launching pretty long. That's that artificial launch screen I talked about. But a vector image is an image that is drawn by your designer most likely. So it's shapes that are strung together and filled with a color, right? So something like these little icons here, but it doesn't have to be that simple. You know, we have some really cool ones, like here in the guest list part of our app, this envelope is a vector image. And bitmap is made of a bunch of pixels that are, you know, each individually colored and then brought together to form an image. So you can think of like photos like we have here in this carousel, or even, you know, like your profile image. Me and my husband had some fun taking these in front of the step and repeat earlier. So that's the difference between bitmap and vector. So what's cool is with vector images, there's actually software now that will draw these for you because they are just paths and fill colors. So we started with a software called PaintCode until they realized that XO Group isn't a startup and we actually have millions of users, and then started charging us more. And so now we're on Quartz Code until they figure out and catch wise. Hopefully they don't watch this video. These pieces of software are really powerful. You just drag your asset in, and it'll literally just churn out the drawn code. It's really cool. I wish I could just do that myself, but I don't, you know, it would take forever. Hundreds of lines of code just there for you, and it's even written in Swift, and you can just export it and then drag it into your app. Really easy to use. There's also animation that you can add in PaintCode and Quartz Code. I haven't actually done it with PaintCode, full disclosure, but with Quartz Code, it's really easy and kind of fun to actually like watch these images be drawn or have them change and transform, and you can just really play with the animation. So how do you use this then? You know, we drag this into the app, okay, and we can render it, but now if you're going to be using this for your team for a lot of different images, it's going to get a bit cumbersome. There's a lot of repetitive code, for example. All the resizing behavior is in every single file, and that's not dry. So we tried to make this a little bit drier. We ended up making a parent view for knitting and drawing our PaintCode images. This way it was just easier to call them and to work with them when we were rendering a view. And then we made an enum for the resizing behavior. This way we could add that to the parent view, so we didn't have to have that repetitive code. And then we also made an enum case for each asset. And I actually made a PaintCode catalog of all of those cases. We ran into this issue where after a while we had so many, and it's not like an asset catalog where you can just say, you know, you can just go in and look at the different images that are available. We were getting an image from a designer, and we didn't know if we had to recreate the wheel, if it was already in the app or not, and we were kind of asking each other, which isn't the best way to do it. Like, have you seen this before? Do we have this in the app? Like, how would they know? It's huge. So I actually made this hidden in our debug menu, which is only in our debug scheme, so you can actually scroll through and see the different images that we have that are available in PaintCode. You can actually tap on it and see what the enum case is called as well, so that you can very easily call it in your code. So that's just another tip and trick if you guys decide to go that route. So is this a perfect solution? You know, of course not. There's always going to be some issues. Like I said, it's very expensive software, so you have to decide how bad your app launch time is, if it's caused by images, and then see if, you know, if it's worth the money. In our case, it certainly was, and it's been saving us a lot on our app launch time. And also, just to keep in mind, the draw code, some of the draw code also does compile a little bit slowly. We had an internal hackathon a couple weeks ago, and I was working on trying to get our app compile time down, which was very painful. And I put in that flag that tells you which methods are compiling the slowest. Anything that was over 100 milliseconds was getting flagged, and 3 of our draw code methods out of hundreds were flagged. But just so you know, the worst one was 300 milliseconds, which isn't terrible. So we talked about it as a team and decided, since it wasn't that many, and we've been using it for 2 years now, that we didn't think it was a real threat to our compile time, but we'll just kind of keep an eye on it. So for now, like, the benefits outweigh the cost. So what about our bitmap images? For our bitmap images, we actually do have a media API that we were using, but we were underutilizing. So we met with the backend team and told them, you know, why this was so important, and now, you know, whenever we have a bitmap image, we do advocate more and more to have it stored in our media API. And a couple of things that we did to make it a little bit easier to work with is, this is a little bit blurry, but you can kind of see, we created a couple of methods. One is media URL resize for width, and you can just pass in the frame and width of the UI image view that it's going to be put into, and it'll resize the image before it renders so that we're saving a little bit of memory. And then set SD web image with animation duration. This actually will let you set a placeholder image that'll show so that it's not blocking the UI. And then once the image is fetched from the URL, it'll render and it'll kind of like has this fade animation where the one fades out and the other one fades in. So it looks kind of nice to the user and isn't so jarring. And you can even, you can make that animation duration last as long as you want. Standard is 0.3 seconds. Sounds pretty quick, but actually the user still does see it. And we even have a completion block that you could pass in if you wanted. So we did this just for all of our images moving forward. We decided not to do this for images that already existed in the catalog. We just said, all right, from now on, whenever a designer gives us a design, we're going to ask for the vector images in PDF form so that we can use paint code, and if they send us a bitmap image, we're going to work with the backend to make sure it gets added to the media API. We're not going to track down old designs and replace existing images that we have. We'll just see how this works over the course of a year and a half, 2 years. So did it work? It certainly did. Our current app launch time is actually only 480 milliseconds, which is crazy. Apple recommends 400. That seemed totally unattainable to me when we first started this. And now we're down to 480. So the app does seem like it has a longer launch time. I don't want you to think like, oh God, Erica's lying to us. I just tapped on it and it takes longer. I'm not lying. We do have that artificial launch screen that shows while we're loading our Taplytics variables, because we do run experiments on our dashboard and on our bottom nav. It's kind of been like a little bit of a back and forth between the engineers and product about how important it is to have experiments that live on the dashboard and the bottom nav. There are good arguments on both sides. They've kind of added more experiments since I got our app launch time down, because they're like, now we have so much time to play with. But so I kind of enabled them. But we'll continue to monitor it and make sure that the app does launch pretty quickly for our users. So now moving forward, like I said, we still have that print statistics on the bottom that spits out our print time, our launch time every time we run our app. And our image loading time actually doesn't even print anymore because it's negligible, which is pretty cool. But we want to keep an eye on it. And like I said, I also will go through every 6 months and check to make sure that there aren't any unused images that are clogging up our asset catalog, make sure that we keep it down. And that is pretty much it.